Really, I was inspired to think about this paper by the invitation from the Gresham College, which I'm very grateful for. The whole idea, I think, of the 19th century and intoxicants raised by the idea of from gin lane to a band of hope really caused me, I think, to think again about my work on cannabis. I've just completed my second book on cannabis in the British Cannabis Nation, which brings a story up to the present day from 1928. But what I'll be talking about in the next half an hour or so, I guess, is the research I did for its predecessor, Cannabis Britannica, which very much looked at the history of cannabis in the British in the period before 1928. I guess the reason I embarked on this research topic 10 or more years ago was because I noticed that there was a gap in 19th century accounts of medicines and intoxicants. Ever since Brian Harrison's seminal work, we have been aware of the importance of alcohol in 19th century British social history. And of course, Virginia Berridge published her Opium and the People, originally back in the 1980s, in which she began to look at the way in which opium had become popular and then become the object of suspicion in 19th century Britain. I began to wonder what other drugs there were out there, and I was conscious that cannabis, when I first started writing this book 10 years or so ago, cannabis was, of course, in the news. It was the subject of some discussion about whether it should be legalised or reclassified, and this debate ultimately ended in the reclassification of 2003 under David Blunkett. My original research had been on mental hospitals and the psychiatric system established in India by the British during the period of colonial rule, where I'd noticed that the British often blamed cannabis consumption in local societies for the mental illness that they were observing in these newly built hospitals. And I began to wonder whether there was a direct link between what I was hearing in the news, David Blunkett, reclassification, legalisation and so on, and these 19th century British encounters with cannabis abroad. And really what I hope to argue today is that there is indeed a direct link. And if you like, cannabis is the forgotten drug of 19th century British history. Really, what I hope to do is answer this question. Why were cannabis preparations heralded as popular medicines in the middle of the 1800s and yet subjected to a parliamentary condemnation and a commission of inquiry by the end of the century? Because what we find is that cannabis, as we'll see, cannabis was briefly heralded as a wonder drug by Victorian doctors, only to become the object of some suspicion. Now, as you read through the paper, or maybe have a look at the books, you'll come across all sorts of different names for cannabis. And I suppose I really want to touch on a couple of these first, because these things will be used as I go along, but they're not interchangeable. And really, most of these names come from the British encounter with South Asia. Britain, of course, began to assert control over what was to be British India from 1757 onwards. And really, by the turn of the century, by 1800, the foundations of the British Empire had been laid. And what the British were doing whilst in South Asia was attempting to make money through three mechanisms. First of all, trade, secondly, land tax, and thirdly, finding new products to take back to European markets. In many ways, the history of opium that's been charted by Virginia Berridge is one example of the way in which empire brought exotic new medicinal products back onto the British market. What the British found when they were observing drugs cultures in South Asia was that they were dealing with a variety of different preparations of the cannabis plant. Indeed, there was some confusion at the time about exactly what the plant was. There was some confusion about cannabis sativa, which is the cannabis plant as we know it. The British began a debate really about whether there was a completely different strain to be found in Asia called cannabis indica, or whether this was simply a variety of the cannabis sativa. They also called it Indian hemp, and more recently it's been called marijuana. Ganja, a word some of you may be familiar with, is certainly used during this period for the preparations from the dried flower head, and these are usually smoked. Bhang are preparations made from the leaves and stalks, preparations which are usually drunk. Charas and hashish. Charas is a South Asian word, hashish a North African word, really for the dried exudation, the sticky stuff that comes out the top of the plants, which is usually dried and smoked. Majum is a green sweetmeat, a sort of fudge or confection made using cannabis. And mudat is a preparation of hemp and opium. And part of the reason I think I put this up for you to have a look at is because it gives us a sense of how diverse and complex South Asia's experience of cannabis was. And again, it's certainly in the beginning of the 21st century, it's difficult to categorise exactly the way in which South Asians saw cannabis. But the best way I think of thinking about it is, first of all, they saw cannabis preparations as medicinal. And they would use cannabis preparations for dealing with the aches and pains of malaria. They'd use cannabis as a sedative, and really for a whole variety of purposes, specifically aimed at dealing with illness and really treating the symptoms of illness rather than trying to cure illness. But they also used cannabis simply for purposes of intoxication. They saw cannabis as fun. Cannabis was something you could take with your friends to ease conversation, to pass a hot afternoon away. But also, South Asians saw cannabis as somewhere in between. They didn't use cannabis simply for purposes of recreation or simply for medicinal purposes. They used, and again the term I use is a Victorian one, they often used preparations of cannabis as a tonic. In other words, this was a sort of pick-me-up, something that could be used to relax you. It wasn't being used purely for fun, but it wasn't really being used to deal with a specific complaint. Cannabis had these multiple functions in South Asian society. And really what we find is that the British medical establishment, which had no real experience of cannabis back in Britain, began to explore cannabis medicines and cannabis preparations when they began to serve abroad in the empire. Without going into too much detail, cannabis, it's a story I often tell. When I first started doing this project, I thought I'm going to be thorough. So I'm going to take the project right back into the mists of time. So there I was, sat in going through commercial dictionaries of the 16th and 17th centuries. And to my great excitement, I discovered that the Elizabethans were trying to grow cannabis across the home counties. And I thought, blimey, this is my passage to TV series and multi-awards. I'm going to rewrite the history of 16th century England. And of course, they were growing fields of cannabis sativa, not for purposes of intoxication, but for rope. And you find that in Northern Europe, cannabis sativa grows perfectly well, but because of our climate, the thing goes to fibre. So they're tall, lovely and tall and woody, but useless for purposes of intoxication. And whilst British doctors had gleaned knowledge of cannabis medicines from Arabic and from Greek medical texts, there was very little experience of cannabis itself up until the 19th century, not least of all because cannabis is difficult to transport. Given the naval technologies of the period, shipping a load of cannabis all the way back from South Asia to the UK would usually mean that what turned up here was dried out and useless for purposes of medicine and intoxication. So it wasn't really until the 19th century when British doctors began to travel around the empire and to serve in the empire that they began to encounter cannabis drugs. Our earliest example of this is a chap called Whitelaw Ainsley. Ainsley was the first British doctor in South Asia to try and compile an encyclopedia of South Asian medical products. His predecessors in the Portuguese Empire included people like Cristobal da Costa, but it was Ainsley, who was serving in Madras, who decided that there needed to be an updated English language version of the whole of the materia medica of Hindustan. And he did this with considerable energy and zeal, compiling a volume in 1813, which would then be published as 2 volumes in an updated version in 1826. Now, in here we find entries on various preparations of cannabis. I'll give you an example here. Here we note his entry on major. This electricity is much used by the Mohammedans, particularly the more dissolute who take it internally to intoxicate and ease pain, and not unfrequently from an overdose of it produce a temporary mental derangement. If you like, what Ainsley has noticed straight away is that these cannabis products in South Asian society have these dual purposes. Yes, he notes that cannabis is being taken to ease pain. In other words, it's being used for medicinal objectives, but he seems far more interested in the exciting stuff. In other words, he seems more interested in the dissolute who take it to intoxicate and produce temporary mental derangement. Ainsley is a very interesting character. I had the good fortune to write his entry in the Dictionary of National Biography. And Ainsley, it turns out, was, in this period, was working in the Botanical Garden a lot, alongside the chief of the Botanical Garden, who himself was a Christian missionary. Ainsley was a committed Christian. He wrote at length about his Christian beliefs and the importance of what he called persevering virtue. Persevering virtue included, and central to it really, was temperance and modesty in lifestyle. So I've argued really that what we see here is, if you like, an early 19th century moralist's version of cannabis preparations in South Asia. In other words, he's observed the multiple uses that South Asians put cannabis medicines to, but has decided to disapprove of them because they're used for purposes of intoxication, an intoxication that he temperamentally disapproves of. Perhaps more famous for his work on cannabis is this chap, William Brooke O'Shaughnessy. Now, I could quite happily spend an afternoon talking about O'Shaughnessy, who's a fascinating character. He was born in Limerick, I think in 1809, and was clearly from quite a grand Catholic family that had fallen on hard times. So the family had put the money into his medical training, and he decided that he was going to do his medical training not in Dublin but in Edinburgh, because in those days getting an Edinburgh medical degree was your passport to the empire, where the opportunities of empire awaited. And it's very clear that even as a young man he was quite a character. To obtain service in the East India Company, it's necessary, much as today, to fill out your application form. And all these application forms are still kept in the archive. So I thought I was sufficiently interested in this chap to call up his application form. And one of the questions, and I suspect that this is a question that some of our public servants and politicians might think about again today, putting on application forms for the civil service, was, have you paid anybody any money in order to obtain this position? And O'Shaughnessy wrote, certainly not. So, no, yeah, not a no or a yes, but a certainly not. And you got a sense of the man's indignation at being asked such a question. O'Shaughnessy was a high flyer. He was publishing papers while he was still at university on cholera. He very quickly enters the East India Company's service, and within 10 years he's become Professor of Chemistry and Medicine at the Medical College of Calcutta, where he was also the government's first chemical examiner. Interestingly, he was knighted in 1856, not for his medical work, but because he laid down the telegraph system in India, a telegraph system which was to go on and actually save the British Empire, because the telegraph system gave the British this advantage in suppressing the mutiny in 1857. They had the technology to communicate backwards and forwards in a matter of hours rather than days or weeks. So O'Shaughnessy became, oddly enough for an Irishman, I suppose, a hero of the British Empire. He got through 3 wives. He lived to the age of 80. He was just one of these great Victorian chaps. His conclusion was that cannabis was a wonder drug, and it was very much O'Shaughnessy who was if you like, the entrepreneur behind the entry of cannabis medicines into the Victorian medical cabinet. O'Shaughnessy, while he was Professor of Chemistry and Medicine, writes these very long accounts of the days he spends basically nosing around the local bazaars, talking to local doctors, having a look at what's being sold in the drug section of the local markets, and then buying some and taking it back to the college in order to try it out. And he conducted this wonderful set of experiments throughout the 1830s on essentially anything that moved around in order to find out what he could find out about cannabis. And again, it's just, I won't go through the conclusion, the whole set of experiments. I'll just read out his conclusion. It seems needless to dwell on the details of each experiment. Suffice it to say that they lead to one remarkable result, that while carnivorous animals and fish, dogs, cats, swine, vultures, crows and adjutants, invariably and speedily exhibited the intoxicating influence of the drug, the graminivorous, such as the horse, deer, monkey, goat, sheep and cow, experienced but trivial effects from any dose we administered. So, anything that moved, he'd managed to drag into the medical college and give cannabis to it. Indeed, the lowest form of animal he could get hold of was medical students, and he tried this on medical students and indeed on himself and his staff. Which meant really, I think, that Whitelaw Ainsley, his predecessor, had gone around asking about cannabis. It's really O'Shaughnessy who seems to be the first British doctor to conduct experiments. And he seems to have brought his customary energy and zeal to this task by experimenting with cannabis on everything. His conclusions were therefore authoritative. He concluded that cannabis was a useful sedative, it was useful in dealing with inflammatory diseases, and perhaps most useful of all to doctors of the period, it was a powerful and valuable remedy in hydrophobia, in tetanus, cholera, and many convulsive disorders. Now, he first published his conclusion in his Bengal Pharmacopoeia and General Conspectus of Medicinal Plants. Like all academics, he dreams of writing a textbook you've got to make all your students buy and read, and this was his textbook for Indian students in the Medical College of Calcutta. But his conclusions were very quickly picked up back in the United Kingdom. The Provincial Medical and Surgical Journal, which was the predecessor of the British Medical Journal, which was become the British Medical Journal in the 1850s, carried two successive front pages in the early 1840s, devoted to O'Shaughnessy's research, and eventually O'Shaughnessy was invited to attend a meeting of the Royal Medico-Botanical Society, essentially the forerunner of the British Medical Association, in London on February the 22nd, 1843. This was, by all accounts, a well-attended meeting. There was much excitement. O'Shaughnessy himself was invited to present a paper. Various others then stood, and there were speeches from the floor in which doctors were quick to report the experiments that they'd made back in the United Kingdom with samples of this drug. And really what we find is that this is the moment that cannabis arrives. Oddly enough, O'Shaughnessy, having made this big splash, he was admitted to the Royal Medico-Botanical Society as an overseas member at this meeting. O'Shaughnessy very quickly drops his interest in cannabis. Indeed, as far as I can tell, he never publishes on it again after this meeting. And as far as I can tell, the reason for this is that he hot-foots it back to India. Almost within weeks of this meeting, because the job of the governor of the Mint of Calcutta has come up, and O'Shaughnessy fancies this job because there's plenty of opportunity here to make one's fortune. So O'Shaughnessy, as soon as he spots the next big thing, decides he's going to drop cannabis and move on to something else. Nevertheless, others took on the task of examining cannabis and experimenting with cannabis. And what we find as we follow the medical journals through the 19th century is that O'Shaughnessy's work has inspired future and successive generations of Victorian doctors. Oddly enough, we find that Victorian doctors settled on two particular types of medicine or medical problem. First of all, they began treating insanity and mental illness with cannabis. And indeed, by the 1870s, Thomas Clouston has won a set of major awards, the Fothergillian Gold Medal, no less, for his work with cannabis in the treatment of mental illness at the Carlisle Mental Hospital. Additionally, as well as really, if you like, cannabis, it was increasingly used in the treatment of mental illness. Cannabis was also being used for the treatment of women. Interestingly enough, there were frequent and recurring reports of cannabis being used in the treatment of period pain, treatment being used in what was then known or diagnosed as hysteria. And interestingly, in the 1850s, a letter to the British Medical Journal from a doctor in Darlington showed that he reported that he was called to the bedside of a woman who was about to go into premature labour in only the 7th month of pregnancy. Now, unfortunately, this had happened with this woman on 4 previous occasions when she'd lost a child. So Jackson decided that desperate measures were called for. So he administered tincture of Indian hemp, tincture of cannabis and alcohol. Because he'd come to the conclusion, or he certainly read, that this would act to stop contractions altogether. So he used tincture of Indian hemp and reported that giddiness in the head, stiffness of the tongue, difficulty of articulation, a tingling sensation all over the body, especially in the tips of fingers, severe vomiting with eructations every 5 minutes, was the outcome of this. By which time I suspect he was panicking, because he then records that, such being the symptoms at my second visit, I was afraid that my patient was about to quit this mortal coil. Nevertheless, next morning the symptoms had abated and the treatment had been successful as she progressed to the 9th month of pregnancy and gave birth to a healthy child. So, cannabis medicines were increasingly used, and if you like, most popular for the treatment of mental illness and also for the treatment of various conditions particular to women. As the 19th century progressed, however, increasingly there were reports of anxiety about the use of cannabis medicines. The reason for this, of course, is that if you're using organic medicines, if you're using a lump of an organic product, you don't really know how much of the active ingredient or ingredients is contained within that lump of organic substance. And whereas 19th century medical science was successful in isolating and extracting the active ingredient in opium, they identified and extracted morphine and codeine, which meant that you could begin to work out what a particular dose would produce in human beings. The active ingredients in cannabis remained elusive until the 1960s, and indeed, we're only really beginning to understand how cannabis works on the human body with the discovery of the endocannabinoid system in the 1990s. So increasingly Victorian doctors were finding that cannabis was an unreliable medicine. Often you could administer a preparation of cannabis and it would have no effect whatsoever, simply because the active ingredients had dried out and had become inactive. Often you could administer a medicine which contained an extremely large dose of these active ingredients, in which case doctors would report patients running around rooms and becoming hysterical and having strange dreams and so on. So gradually cannabis began to drop out of favour with Victorian doctors, partly because it was unreliable, and partly because its reputation began to take on a very different turn. Because of these chaps. Mark Stewart, if you like, cannabis makes its entry into the House of Commons and begins its long political career in 1891, when Mark Stewart MP stood up to ask the Under-Secretary of State for India whether his attention has been called to the statement in the Allahabad Pioneer of the 10th of May last that ganja, which is grown, sold and excised under much the same conditions as opium, is far more harmful than opium, and that the lunatic asylums of India are filled with ganja smokers. As far as I know, this is the first time that cannabis is mentioned in parliamentary proceedings, and it's no coincidence really that Mark Stewart MP isn't a doctor, but he's a prominent member of the Society for the Suppression of the Opium Trade. Stewart was an active temperance campaigner in the 19th century and had been an active member of the anti-opium campaign since the 1860s. By the time we get to the 1890s, the anti-opium campaign is beginning to gather pace, and indeed by 1895, the anti-opium campaign in Parliament has succeeded in forcing the government to order the Royal Opium Commission, a committee of inquiry into the opium trade in South Asia. The anti-opiumists had a number of objections to the opium trade. When you look at the anti-opium campaign, many, if not most of them, are committed Christian temperance campaigners. So many of them spend much of their time arguing and campaigning against alcohol and alcohol consumption in the 19th century British society. And they very much see opium and later cannabis alongside alcohol as a dangerous source of intoxication, and intoxication that they regard as essentially immoral, something that they just simply regard as a source of wickedness. Many of the anti-opium campaigners, however, are also anti-imperialists who object to the British Empire and the whole idea of Britain having an empire, which they regarded either as immoral, this was the domination of one race over another, or simply uneconomic. The economics of empire made no sense to many liberals, who latched on to the opium trade between India and China, which Britain had fought wars over in the 19th century in order to preserve. They latched on this as an emblem, if you like, of all the evils of imperialism. They decided that selling a dangerous intoxicant from a British colony into China simply for profit was evidence of the evils of empire and the lengths to which imperialists would go in order to maintain their power and wealth. So really what we see here is the moment when cannabis is being dragged into this set of debates. Cannabis is, it stands accused of being far more harmful than opium, and it's causing mental illness across the empire. This was a wonderful stick with which to beat the government because, of course, in the 19th century in India, the British government had taken the decision simply to tax cannabis rather than try and seek to prohibit it. Basically, they turned up there, found that there was a blossoming market for cannabis products in South Asia. They certainly weren't minded to interfere with this. Indeed, they decided they may as well take their cut and imposed a tax on the cannabis trade in South Asia. They were very careful to cover this in some justification. They would argue that they were using the tax not in order to raise revenue, but in order to set the price of cannabis artificially high in order to discourage excessive consumption, much on the same logic as the government levies a tax on alcohol today. But nevertheless, the suspicion remained that they simply saw this as an opportunity to increase their excise income. Whilst this was Mark Stewart's only ever statement on cannabis, his anxieties about the drug were taken up with more energy by this chap, William Sproston Kane, MP. Kane was a liberal, and he had visited India on 3 occasions and had observed the local drugs trades for himself. He reported that here and there throughout the bazaar are little shops whose entire stock consists of a small lump of greenish pudding, which is being retailed out in tiny cubes. This is another government monopoly and is a preparation of the deadly bung or Indian hemp, known in Turkey and Egypt as hashish, the most horrible intoxicant the world has yet produced. For those of you who are interested, that's a photograph taken from the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission when they attempted to go around India photographing typical cannabis consumers. And it's very interesting because what they do is they classify it. So you've got your moderate consumers, your occasional consumers, and these are your excessive consumers, pictured here. What happens here is that cannabis becomes another stick with which the anti-opium campaigners begin to beat the government on the issue of opium. What you find is that the government decides that it's going to try and buy off the anti-opium campaigners by giving in to them on cannabis, because there was very little real interest in cannabis on the part of any of these people. So what you found was that the government actually orders a committee of inquiry into cannabis before it orders the Royal Opium Commission, the result being the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission of 1893/4. And there was some anxiety in anti-opium circles that whether this should be seen as a victory or a defeat. Because on the one hand, it was a victory that they'd managed to dig in and force the government to acknowledge its shortcomings, or certainly to examine its shortcomings on drugs. But nevertheless, it seemed like a defeat because the drug that the government had given in on was the one that they were least interested in. Indeed, you find that when you read through Abkari, which is the in-house magazine of the anti-opium campaigners in the 1890s, as soon as they get the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission, they stop referring to cannabis whatsoever. In other words, they have no real interest in cannabis. Opium was the issue on which they were trying to force the government, something they succeeded in doing in 1895. So here, if you like, we have a commission of inquiry that nobody's really interested in. The Indian Hemp Drugs Commission was made up of 3 Indians and 5 British officials. It spent 266 days out in India, gathering evidence that went into 8 volumes. And its conclusions were these: that cannabis did not cause crime. In other words, cannabis consumption in India was not the cause of social problems. It argued that the asylum statistics that were being used by the anti-opium campaigners were highly unreliable. You may remember Mark Stewart raised this alarming spectacle of the Lunatic Asylums of India being full of Ganja smokers. The Indian Hemp Drugs Commission concluded that this was entirely false. In fact, if this conclusion could be drawn from the asylum statistics, this demonstrated how poorly the statistical information was being gathered rather than reflecting any epidemiological problem related to the drug. It observed and came to the conclusion that moderate use of cannabis in South Asian society was harmless, and in certain cases could even be beneficial to those living in malarial regions, for example, who had to manage the symptoms of malaria. But it did concede that excessive use may cause mental health problems, although of course it was very careful not to stipulate what excessive use might be. There's my conclusions. Why is all this important, and what use is it to anybody looking back at the period? I think the story that I've begun to explore of cannabis in the British in today's brief presentation is important because from our perspective it demonstrates, I think, that the history of cannabis in the British extends well beyond the 1960s. And into the 19th century. Certainly when I began my research 10 or more years ago, there was an easy assumption when I talked to historians, to policymakers, to doctors, that cannabis was something that arrived with the counterculture in the 1960s. And if it had simply appeared in the 1960s, hopes were it would simply disappear just as quickly as if it turned up. My argument is that this is a false supposition, that cannabis did not simply appear in British history in the 1960s. And in fact, the British have been interested in cannabis well into the 19th century. But when we look at this history, this long history of cannabis in the British, I think we see that for much of this history, cannabis has been confused with other drugs like alcohol and opium. And one can certainly argue that this confusion remains to this day. We saw in the 1890s that the anti-opium campaigners were readily seizing on cannabis and not really considering it for its own virtues and its own shortcomings, but simply assuming that it was something like opium and therefore it was grist to their mill. Similarly, earlier in the 19th century, we look at doctors like Whitelaw Ainsley. Ainsley was writing about cannabis, but very much from within his own prejudices towards intoxication, alcoholic intoxication in particular, and therefore viewing cannabis through that prism, the prism of his own anxieties and attitudes towards drink. So I think that when one reads through the often confused debates in the media and in policy circles and in government about cannabis, to this day, one can see this confusion, this ready ability to mix cannabis up with other substances in discussions itself has a long history and will probably be difficult to remedy. Finally, I hope I've begun to demonstrate today that the attitudes and approaches towards cannabis have often been shaped by wider agendas and prejudices. Whether this be the entrepreneurial ambitions of OShaughnessy, whether this be the temperance anxieties of Whitelaw Ainsley, or indeed the political ambitions and agendas of the anti-imperialists and the anti-opium campaigners. And I would argue that these attitudes and approaches have continued to be, towards the drug, have continued to be shaped by wider agendas and prejudices to this day. But that's the new book, and that's for another day. Thank you.